Right, guys. Now, in the last session, we have seen what is bean configuration file and how to declare Spring Bean definition, how to configure our Java class as a how to configure Java class as a Spring Bean that we have discussed in the last session. How to perform setter injection and how to perform constructor injection also we have discussed. If we perform both setter injection and constructor injection for the same variable, what is going to happen also we discussed. And when I declare the beans, when I declare the classes as a Spring Beans, IOC container creating object for the bean classes. Now, today's topic, bean scopes. Our today's topic is bean scopes. In Spring Framework, bean scope will represent how many objects should be created for a Spring Bean. Bean scope will represent, bean scope will decide, or bean scope will decide how many objects should be created for a Spring Bean. How many objects should be created for a Spring Bean, that will be decided by bean scope concept. Now, the default scope of a Spring Bean is a singleton. The default scope is singleton, means only one object will be created. Only one object will be created by IOC container. If we want to create multiple objects, then we can go for prototype scope. There are several scopes are available. We can configure below scopes for Spring Bean. We can configure below scopes for Spring Bean. What are those? First one is singleton. Second one is prototype. Third one is request. Fourth one is session. So in the Spring framework, we have a concept called bean scope. Bean scope will decide how many objects should be created for a Spring Bean. Bean scope will decide how many objects will be created for a Spring Bean. The default scope is singleton. That means only one object will be created. We can configure below scopes for Spring Bean: singleton, prototype, request, session. All right, now guys, I'm going to create another project here from the starting. Observe how we are going to create this project. Got it. Next, file, new, Spring project. That means I'm going to create a normal Maven project. Create a simple project. Click on next. Group ID. So I'm giving the group ID as in.AhokIT. Artifact ID 05 Spring Scopes app. Spring Bean Scopes application I'm creating. Click on finish. Yes, Bean Scopes project got created. If you see, by default, this project created with Java 1.5 version. Got it. I want to change this to 1.8 version. How can we do? Right click on the project, build path, configure build path, click on edit, alternate JRE. I added JDK, click on finish, click on apply, click on close. Good, that's fine. Now go to pom.xml. So currently there are no dependencies available. I want to use a Spring framework. So let's add dependencies here. We need to add a dependency. Where we can find out the dependency? We can find out in mvnrepository.com. Let's find Spring-context, click on search, Spring context, click on this. We can copy this and we can paste that here. We can paste that here. Good. So here I configured a Spring context dependency. That means all the jar files of Spring framework which are required to develop our application, the Maven is going to download Spring jar files, and the Spring jar files will be added to our project build path. You see here in our project Maven dependencies folder got created. Spring context jar, Spring AOP, Spring Beans, Spring Core, Spring JCL, Spring Expression. All the jar files downloaded and added to our project build path. All the jar files downloaded and added to our project build path. You got my point, right? Next, here I'm going to create one Java class, new class. That class I'm keeping inside a package in.AhokIT. The package name, you can keep anything. All right, now I'm giving a class name. Let me take a class with a name called motor. I'm taking a class with a name called motor. Inside this class, I'm writing one constructor, a zero param constructor only. I'm writing system.out.println motor constructor. System.out.println motor constructor I'm keeping here. Clear for all of you? System.out.println motor constructor class I have created. Now I want to represent this class as a Spring Bean. Do you know how to represent this class as a Spring Bean? Do you know how to represent this class as a Spring Bean? Any idea? Now here I'm creating one bean configuration file. So you can give any name for the file. I'm giving the name as spring-beans.xml. Spring-beans.xml. I have given the name as spring-beans.xml. Now, so do you know how to configure a class as a Spring Bean? So I'm going to take a bean ID, a motor, class is equal to fully qualified class name motor I'm taking. Fully qualified class name motor I am taking. Bean ID is equal to motor. Class is equal to in.AhokIT.motor. I have configured my Java class as a Spring Bean in this XML. All right. Now let's go here and create one class called test class in order to test our application, start the IOC container. Okay. So do you know how to start a IOC container? Do you know how to start a IOC container? Come on, guys. Do you know how to start a IOC container? How to start IOC container? Yes, by using application context, we are going to start our IOC container. Application context. Application context. Context is equal to new class path XML application context. That means I have a XML file for beans configuration. I'm going to give that file name as a parameter, spring-beans.xml. Spring-beans.xml. Now with this, can you tell me what I have done in this program? Can you tell me what I have done in this program? I have just created the object for application context by giving beans.xml file as a input. That means I am starting my IOC container. I am just starting my IOC container. Are you clear? Fine. Now let's run this application, run as Java application. Can you see for motor class object is created? In the motor class, I have a zero param constructor. So whenever object is created for a class, the constructor will be executed. So here motor class is available. For the motor class, I configured a bean. Bean ID is equal to motor. Class is equal to fully qualified class name. Just Bean definition I have configured for the motor, and I'm just starting my IOC container. So with this, what IOC is doing internally, whenever we start the IOC container by using application context, we are giving XML file as a input for that. We are giving XML file as a input for that. SpringBeans.xml. IOC container loading the beans XML, and it is going to scan all the bean definitions. Currently, how many bean definitions are available? Currently, one bean definition is available, that is called motor. Now, let me create one more bean here. Let me create one more bean, car. I'm creating a class called car class. Now, for car class also, I'm going to write one zero param constructor with the SOP statement. Car constructor, I'm taking this. Public class car constructor. In that car constructor, there is a SOP statement. Now go to beans.xml. Let us configure this also as a Spring Bean. Bean ID is equal to car. Class is equal to fully qualified class name. I specified car also as a Spring Bean. Motor is one class, car is one class. So now motor class represented as one Spring Bean and car class also represented as one Spring Bean. Now let's run this program. Right click, run as Java application. Can you see for both classes object got created? Can you see for both classes object got created? For both classes object got created. Am I telling the IOC to create the objects, or by default it is creating the objects? Am I telling the IOC to create the object, or IOC is creating objects by default? Am I telling to IOC to create the objects, or IOC creating the objects by default? Guys, come on. IOC creating the objects by default. Why? Now see here. I'm going to write one method, context dot get bean of car, comma, car dot class. I want to get the car object. I got the car object, which is car one. So here, when the object is creating for our class, whenever the IOC container started, then only object is created by IOC container. Now I want to get the object from the IOC. In order to get the object from the IOC, I'm going to use a method called getBean method. Context dot getBean. Context dot getBean. Bean ID. For every bean there is a ID, and that bean belongs to which class? Bean definition. What is the bean definition ID? So I'm giving here bean definition ID is equal to car, class is equal to in.AhokIT.car. Right now here, context dot get bean of car comma car dot class, get bean, bean ID and bean type, car object I got. Let me print hash code of this object, car1 dot get car1 dot hash code. That is the method. I'm just printing hash code of the object. Right click, run as Java application. Now can you see, for motor class object is created, for car class also object is created. That object hash code I am printing. Now similarly, let me get one more car object. Let me get one more car object. Context dot get bean of car2 dot hash code. Now tell me, how many objects will be created for a car? How many objects will be created for a car? One object will be created, or two objects will be created for the car now? How many objects will be created for the car now? Now tell me, car object will be created when the 10th line got executed or when the 12th line got executed. In this scenario, car object is created when the 10th line of code is executed or when the 12th line of code is executed. When the 10th line of code is executed. Whenever the IOC container started, it is going to load the beans configuration file. It will read all the bean definitions and it is creating the objects. There are two beans available. One is a car, another one is motor. One is a car, another one is motor. When the 10th line of code is executed, bean objects will be created. Then when you call context.getBean, bean which is already created, it is going to return that. Bean which is already created, it is going to return that. So 12th line is just getting the bean object which is already created by the IOC container. And the 15th line getting the bean object which is already created by the IOC container. Now I'm trying to get the two bean objects. Now run this program, right click, run as Java application. Can you see hash codes are different for both objects? Hash code same for both objects. Hash code is different for both objects. Hash code is same for both objects. Hash code is same. That means for car class, how many objects got created? How many objects got created for the car? Only one object is created. The reason, by default, every Spring Bean is singleton. Bean scope will decide how many objects should be created for a, Spring Bean. The default scope of Spring Bean is singleton. That means only one object will be created. We can configure below scopes for Spring Bean. Singleton, prototype, request, session. For singleton beans, objects will be created when IOC container starts. That's it. If you start the IOC container, then immediately the IOC container is going to, when you start the IOC container, immediately IOC container is going to scan the objects and it is going to create the objects. It is going to scan the bean definitions and it is going to create the objects. Now see here, I'm running test class application context, right click, run as Java application. Motor constructor is executed, car constructor is executed. Am I asking the IOC to create the object or it is a default behavior? Am I asking the IOC to create the object or it is a default behavior? It is a default behavior. Now, what is the scope of these two beans now? Singleton. What is the scope of these two beans now? The scope is singleton. Got it? The scope is singleton. So only one object. So if I create object now or if I create object later, only one object should be created now. That's why whenever IOC container starts, objects will be created for singleton. Now let me change the scope. Scope is equal to prototype. So see here, how many scopes the Spring is supporting now? In the current version, how many scopes the Spring is supporting? 4 scopes: singleton, prototype, request, session. Earlier, global session also available, but that got removed. From Spring 3.x version. So earlier global session scope also available, but that global session scope removed from the Spring 3.x version. It is not available now. Now we have only 4 scopes. So what are the 4 scopes? Singleton, prototype, request, session. Do I really need to specify singleton? If I specify or if I don't specify, the default scope is singleton. Only one object will be created. Whenever IOC container starts, it is going to create the object for that singleton. Okay, now here I'm going to specify scope is equal to prototype. I'm going to specify the scope as a prototype. Now motor class having scope as a prototype, car class doesn't have a scope. Means it comes under default scope. The default scope of the Spring Bean is singleton. The default scope of the Spring Bean is singleton. Chalo, run our application. Run as Java application. Oh, for which class object is created? Is it creating object for all the classes? Is it creating object for all the classes? Is it creating object for all the classes? Come on, guys. Is it creating object for all the classes, or it is not creating object for all the classes? Why it is creating object for only one class? Why it is creating object for only one class? Scope, scope, prototype. If the bean scope is a prototype, when you call the get bean, then only it will create the object. If the bean scope is a singleton, by default, object will be created when the IOC container starts. When the IOC container starts. Clear? Now go to this test class. Go to this test class. Context dot get bean of motor. Class type motor dot class. Motor dot class. Right? Bean. Motor bean object I have created. I'm calling get bean. Context dot get bean of motor dot class. Now run this. Run as Java application. Now see, motor object is created. This is motor 1, motor 1, motor 2. I'm getting motor 1 and motor 2. Let me print a hash code of this system.out.println of motor 1 dot hash code and system.out.println of motor 2 dot hash code. Motor 1 dot hash code and motor 2 dot hash code. Let's run this application. Right click, run as Java application. For the motor, how many times the constructor is executed? For the motor, how many times the constructor got executed, guys? Can you tell me? How many times the constructor got executed? 2 times. Hash code is same or hash code is different for the motor? Hash code is same for the motor or hash code is different for the motor? Hash code is different for the motor. Why 2 different hash codes generated? 2 different objects created. When the object is created, object for the motor, object creating at the 10th line, object creating at the 12th line. For the motor class, 12th line. Why object is creating at the 12th line? Amar, not 10th. Object creating at the 12th line. Why object creating at the 12th line for the motor? Motor is prototype bean. Motor is the prototype bean. So whenever you start the IOC container will read your beans configuration file and IOC will create the objects for singleton beans by default. Singleton beans means the classes will have only one object. Singleton beans means those classes will have only one object. By default, IOC container for singleton beans objects will be created when IOC starts. When we call getBean method, when we call context.getBean method, when we call context.getBean method, then object will be created for prototype beans. Got my point? When we call context.getBean method, then object will be created for prototype beans. For singleton beans, object will be created by default. For prototype beans, objects will be created when we call getBean method. GetBean method. Prototype beans, for prototype scoped beans, for every call on demand basis, new object will be created. For singleton beans, objects will be created when IOC starts. For prototype beans, objects will be created when we call context.getBean. Singleton means only one object. Now, for prototype beans, every time new object will be created. For prototype beans, every time new object will be created. Read this point, guys. In the Spring framework, there is a concept called bean scope. In the Spring framework, there is a concept called bean scope. Bean scope will decide how many objects should be created for a Spring Bean. Bean scope will decide how many objects should be created for a Spring Bean. The default scope of Spring Bean is singleton. That means only one object will be created. We can configure below scopes for Spring Bean: singleton, prototype, request, session. For singleton beans, objects will be created when IOC container starts. When we call context.getBean method, then object will be created for prototype beans. For prototype beans, every time new object will be created. Are you guys clear with my point? What is bean scope? What is a singleton? What is a prototype? When the object is creating for singleton, when the object will be created for singleton, when the object will be created for prototype. Are you guys comfortable with my point? Are you guys comfortable with my point? Request and session scopes are related to Spring Web MVC concept. When we are going to develop a web application by using Spring, then we are going to talk about request and session. Request and session concepts are related to Web MVC. So when we are talking about Web MVC, when we are developing web applications, then we will learn about this request and session concepts. Now here I have a question. Here I have a question. Right? Why the default scope is a singleton? Why Spring framework made the default scope of the Spring Bean as singleton? Can anyone guess, and can you tell me why the default scope is a singleton? Why the default scope is singleton? What is the default scope? Default scope is singleton or default scope is a prototype? Default scope is singleton or default scope is a prototype? The default scope is singleton. The default scope is singleton. Why? Why the default scope is singleton? To save the memory. To save the memory. To save the memory. Now, let's think about a web application, guys. Let's think about a web application. We are developing one web application. We are developing one web application. In this web application, one controller is available, one service is available, and one DAO is available in our web application. Okay, so this is my controller class. This is my controller class. Right, this is my service class. This is my service class. This is my DAO class. DAO class. Here we have a DB. That's fine. Application will communicate with this DB to perform operations. It is DB. DAO class is going to communicate with the database. Now, there are several clients available to access our application. For them, we have UI, user interface is available for our application. User interface is going to talk to our backend server. So this is called as backend of our application. This is backend of our application, and this is front end of our application. Backend and front end. For this application, clients are available, users who are going to access our application. Multiple, this is a web application. Multiple clients can access our application at a time. This project we developed by using Spring framework. This project we developed by using Spring framework. So general, in real time, application will be developed like this. Backend application will be available and front-end application will be available. In the backend, we have controller, which will deal with request and response. We have a service, which will deal with business logic, and we have a DAO, which will deal with persistent logic. Controller is available, service is available, DAO available. Controller deal with web layer, request and response logic will be available. Service will deal with business layer. DAO will deal with data access object, persistence layer. Now, clients are sending a request to our application. They are accessing the UI. They are performing some operation on the UI. They are performing some operation on the UI. For example, they want to create one account in our application. So by using UI, they are creating one application. Whenever client request comes, one object is created. One object is created for controller. One object is created for service. One object is created for DAO. First request got executed. Whenever second request comes from the client, again, one object created for controller, one object created for service, one object created for DAO. Third request came, one object created, one object created, one object created. Fourth request came, one object created, one object created, one object created. For every user, do we really need to create the objects? For every request, do I really need to create the object? For every request, do I really need to create the object? Now, for example, 1,000 users are accessing our application. Now, how many objects should be created for 1,000 users in this scenario? 1,000 controller objects, 1,000 service objects, 1,000 DAO objects. That means 3,000 objects will be created for processing 1,000 requests. If 1 lakh people accessing our application, 1 lakh into 3 lakh objects should be created. If 1 crore people accessing our application, 3 crore objects should be created. Then think about JVM's memory. If you create a new object for every request, think about the JVM's memory. Think about the memory management. If you create a new object for every request. Guys, come on. Now, do I really need to create a new object for every request, or one object is sufficient to process all the incoming requests? If I have one object for the controller, with that one object, can I handle all the incoming requests? Yes, with one object, we can handle all the incoming requests. For controller, one object required. For service, one object required. For DAO, one object is required. By using that object, we can execute methods for multiple times. For every request, method should be executed. No need to create a new object for every request. If you create a new object for every request, then unnecessarily you are wasting your memory in the JVM. Your project will run into out of memory problems. If you create a new object for every class, for every request, If you create a new object for every class, for every request, unnecessarily your JVM's memory will be wasted and your project will run into out of memory problems. Your project will run into out of memory problems. So to solve this problem, what Spring Framework has done, when you represent controller as a Spring Bean, so can I say controller will be represented as a Spring Bean in the project? Yes, we will represent controller as a Spring Bean, and we will represent service as a Spring Bean. We will represent DAO as a Spring Bean. Now, how many objects will be created for controller in the whole project? How many times IOC will create the object for the controller? Only one time the object will be created. One object will be created. Here one object will be created. Here also one object will be created. Only one object will be created for Spring Beans by default. Now you understand why Spring kept scope as a singleton. You understood why Spring kept the default scope as a singleton. Why not prototype? Why not prototype? If they keep the default scope as a singleton, if they keep default scope as a prototype, then what will happen? If the default scope is a prototype, then what is going to happen? If the default scope is a prototype, then what is going to happen? For every request, new object will be created, then memory issues will come. So that is the reason by default, Spring will consider your bean as a singleton bean and only one object will be created. That is the default. If you have any scenario, if you want to create a new object every time, then you can go for prototype scope. That is custom requirement. If you have any custom requirement, then you can configure your bean scope as a prototype. If you have a custom requirement, I want to create a new object. I want to create a new object. Then you can go for prototype scope. Now, let us take one scenario. Let us take one scenario. When you go for a bank or any store, there will be one token generator machine. There will be one token generator machine will be available, which is used to generate a token. If you go for a SBI bank, they will issue a token. Now, for every customer, they should generate one new token. Yes or no? Token generator is one machine. Token generator is one class. So for first customer, we want to generate one token. For second customer, we want to generate one token. For third customer, we want to generate one token. For every customer, new token should be created, but a token generator is only one. So now, can I say token is a prototype and token generator as a singleton? Come on, guys. Now, this token is generating for Raju. This token is generating for Rani. This token is generated for Mahesh. This token is generated for Suresh. Come on, guys. This one, I will configure token generator. I'm going to configure as a singleton bean because only one object is sufficient. One generator object is sufficient to generate multiple tokens. So that means it depends upon the requirement. To generate a token, do I need one object of the generator or I need multiple objects of the generator? To generate a token, one token generator object is sufficient. Here, this one can be prototype. This is prototype bean. Prototype. This is prototype. This is prototype. This is prototype. That means a new object by using this. By using this. Are you guys getting my point? Are you guys getting my point? Token generator will be a singleton, only one object. That a token will generate a new token for every customer. A new token object will be created for every customer. New token object will be used as a prototype. So that depends upon the requirement. Now you may get a doubt, sir, here if one controller object is created, how to handle multiple user requests? For every user request, one thread will be created, guys. In the server, one thread will be created for every request to process. For controllers, for services, for DAOs in the project, only one object will be created to execute. Right? For services, for controllers, for services, for DAOs, only one object will be created. When multiple users are trying to access our application, for every user request, for every user request, one thread will be created. Are you guys able to follow my point? These spring beans, controller will be represented as a spring bean, service will be represented as a spring bean, DAO also will be represented as a spring bean. Only one object will be created for these bean classes. So if you get 1000 requests also, only one object will be created for each class, because by default they are singleton. Whenever IOC container starts, it is going to create the object for singleton beans. Whenever IOC container starts, then only object will be created for singleton bean. Are you guys clear with my point? When IOC container starts, then it is going to create the object for singleton beans. Now, how it is going to handle multiple user requests? If the object is singleton, how it is going to handle multiple requests? Threads will be created to handle. For every request, one thread will be created. Once the request processing is completed, that thread will dead. Okay, so here our server, we are going to run our application in a server, right? That server is implemented by using a multi-threading concept. For every request, a new thread will be created. For every request, a new thread will be created. Are you guys clear with my point? Are you guys clear with my point? Now, sir, when to go for a prototype? You got my concept? When to go for a prototype? Token generator is one class. Token is one class. For every customer, we want to generate a new token. So new object should be created for the token. So token I am going to represent as a prototype. Token we are going to represent as a prototype. So to generate multiple tokens, one token generator class is sufficient. So token generator we are going to take as a singleton, and token we are going to take as a prototype. Are you guys comfortable with my point? Are you guys comfortable with my point? Good. So with this, we understood what is bean scopes concept. Bean scope will decide how many objects should be created for a spring bean. The default scope of spring bean is a singleton. That means only one object will be created. We can configure below scopes for spring bean. That means singleton, prototype, request, session. For singleton beans, objects will be created when IOC starts. For prototype beans, when we call context dot get bean, for prototype beans, when we call context dot get bean method, then object will be created. For prototype beans, every time new object will be created. So now to save the memory, to save memory, Spring framework made the default scope as singleton. The default scope as singleton. So to process multiple user requests, it is going to create only one object. If you create multiple objects, if you create a new object for every request, then your JVM will die because it cannot allocate the memory for those many objects which are created. Those many objects. Are you guys comfortable with my point? Are you guys comfortable with my point? Very good. Bean scopes. So interviewer will ask you, what is bean scopes? How many scopes are available? What is singleton? What is prototype? Why singleton is the default? Why not prototype is the default? You got my concept? Why singleton is the default? You got my concept? Why singleton is the default? Yes, to save the memory. If only one object is created, then how it is handling multiple user requests? If scope is singleton, how it is handling multiple user requests, guys? Can anyone tell me? How it is handling multiple user requests? How it is handling multiple user requests? By using threading concept. Internally, it is going to use a threading concept. Internally, it is using threading concept. You got my point? Good. Fine, guys. Thank you. So tomorrow we are going to understand a new concept that is called auto wiring, which is very, 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 very important. In the tomorrow session, we'll talk about auto wiring concept. Thank you.